November 1942. Across the rain-soaked fields of eastern England, fog clung to everything. Hangar roofs, oil-streaked runways, and the cold metal skin of B-17 flying fortresses. Deep, rhythmic thunder of Pratt & Whitney or 1820. Engines rolled across the mist. At every base of the 8th Air Force, from Buzzingbourne to Thurla, young American airmen climbed aboard their aircraft, carrying maps, rubber life vests, and small Lucky Charms from sweethearts back home. None of them yet knew they were about to fly into a sky where there was no room for mistakes. Before the sun could pierce the thick East Anglian clouds, groups of B-17s began to taxi down the runway, exhaust smoke mixing with the damp air in pale gray ribbons. In the pilot's seat, Lieutenant Jack Harmon, 22, from Texas, gripped the control column tightly. Behind him sat 9 crewmates: nose gunner, bombardier, flight engineer, turret gunner, and 2 men in the tail, all packed inside a freezing aluminum fuselage stitched together by over 30,000 rivets. As the aircraft lifted off, shuddered, then steadied at 3,000 feet. The English countryside vanished into the white mist below. Tiny biaches, winding rivers, and distant coastlines slipped away the border between safety and war. The mission began. 10, 20, then 30 B-17s formed up in tight ranks, heading east. They called it a mission. But for those crossing the English Channel for the first time, it felt like stepping through a door no one wished to open. Beyond it lay Germany, where hundreds of anti-aircraft guns waited, and veteran Luftwaffe pilots lingered near airfields from Lille. 2. Bremen and Kiel. At 25,000 feet, the air dropped to 40 below zero. Each breath froze into mist on oxygen masks. Skin cracked beneath thick leather gloves. On a map, the route drawn in red pencil looked like a thin, straight line. In reality, it was the longest, most dangerous road in the world. As they crossed the French coast, the lead pilot radioed, "Bandits ahead." Moments later, tiny black specks appeared on the horizon, growing larger, circling, then splitting into perfect attack formations. They were Messerschmitt Bf-19s and Focke-Wulf FW 190. Segundos de Luftwaffes, hunting falcons. In seconds, the quiet sky exploded. The shriek of 20mm cannons tore through wind and steel. White vapor trails slashed the air. Shells burst amid the bomber formation. In Harmon's nose turret, young gunner Charles Chuck Davis clamped down on his twin Browning M2 South, firing wildly ahead. But the B-17's nose guns were weak, with narrow arcs of fire, helpless against head-on assaults. AFW 190 dove straight at them at nearly 500 miles per hour, unleashing a stream of cannon fire. The cockpit glass shattered. Icy air howled in. The bomber lurched violently. In that instant, the Americans realized a bitter truth. The B-17, the so-called flying fortress, was not invincible. 10 machine guns and thick armor could not protect it forever, especially when formations broke apart and each crew fought alone. The European sky was too vast, and there were too few on T-ground. At 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, officers watched the mission's progress on radar. One by one, the bright dots faded. 1, 2, then 5. The aircraft never reappeared. Reports arrived hours later. Hit by enemy fighters, crew missing. Each line of text meant 10 young men gone forever. Telegrams soon reached homes in New York, Chicago, Kansas, families reading them in silence, tears falling onto kitchen tables. Meanwhile, at Luftwaffe bases like St. Unrada, L.A. German pilots returned, removed their helmets, wiped sweat from their brows, and exchanged weary smiles. They knew the Americans would come again. Industrial war left no pause. Yet they also knew this: If the flying fortresses kept flying alone, the outcome was already written. Dot up above, through freezing winds and roaring engines, the surviving American crews pressed on. Reaching their target, an oil refinery near Rouen, the bombardier leaned over the Norden bomb, adjusted the aim, and pressed the release. Dozens of 500-pound bombs fell away like gray stars, tumbling toward the earth. Explosions rolled across the industrial zone, sending black columns of smoke hundreds of feet high. Seconds later, flak guns opened fire. Shells burst at 25,000 feet, forming dense clouds of black shrapnel. Metal shards sliced through wings, fuselages, and flesh. By the time they returned, only 2/3 of the formation made it home. The survivors limped back with torn skin, gaping holes, missing tails. Some with only one engine still turning. When the wheels touched the runway, the pilots didn't shut down immediately. They just sat there, staring blankly ahead. Some removed their gloves. Their hands trembled, blood crusted on their flight suits. Mechanics ran toward the planes, climbed the wings, counted bullet holes, took photos, made notes. No one spoke. Tay Holkenauen today was luck tomorrow might not be. In a canvas tent by the runway, intelligence officers questioned the survivors. How many enemy fighters did you see? From which direction? How many did you shoot down? The answer was almost always the same. Too many. Someone lit a cigarette. Smoke mingled with the cold air. Outside, the sun had set, and the North Sea wind whispered through bare trees. Far away, the low hum of engines echoed. Perhaps returning B-17 SA, or just ghosts of sound from a distant sky. Their world had shrunk to a brutal rhythm. Eat, fly, bomb, survive. At the bases, nights were filled with whiskey, laughter, and unspoken silence. They joked to forget fear, pasted pinup girls on gave their planes names like Memphis Belle, Hell's Angel, or Little Miss Mischief, trying to turn cold steel into something human. But every morning, they knew, some friends wouldn't come back, and the empty spaces on the flight line grew longer each day. Those missions marked the beginning of a brutal chapter. They proved that courage alone wasn't enough. The U.S. Air Force needed a new strategy, a way for dozens of B-17s to protect one another in hostile skies. But in those early months, all they had were faith and will. In the winter skies, among heavy clouds and the smell of cordite, each B-17 flew on alone. Steel ships, adrift in a boundless sea of cloud. And if you had been there, looking through a frost-glazed window, watching tracers streak across the heavens, you would understand why they called them the lonely missions, where every second was a battle between survival and fate. Over the skies of Europe, the war raged on day after day. Loss reports piled high on the desks of the 8th Air Force headquarters. Bombing missions went out and never returned. Every downed B-17 carried 10 young lives with it, boys barely in their 20s, who had not yet lived their youth. In London, in rooms where lights burned through the night, generals began to ask the question no one wanted to face. Can daylight bombing survive? But amid the grim statistics and sterile reports, one man refused to believe in failure. Curtis LeMay, colonel, 35 years old, from Ohio. Stocky build, square jaw, cold eyes, and a gravelly voice shaped by hundreds of combat hours through smoke and flak. It was nordisk bound to commander. LeMay flew with his crews, sat in the pilot's seat, breathed gunpowder, and saw firsthand what their tactics were costing them. One December morning in 1942, at Rafchelveston in Northamptonshire, the fog hung thick as ever. LeMay stood by the runway, flight jacket damp with dew, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Before him stretched a line of B-17s being rearmed, patched, their wings replaced. He knew each one by number, by crew, by face, and which of those faces might not return tomorrow. They had flown too far, too loosely, and died because of isolation in the sky. LeMay wrote in his notebook, "We can't survive flying like this. Each plane is a separate target. We must make the Luftwaffe see not one B-17, but 21 fused into one solid mass. No gaps. No weakness. From that idea, he began sketching a new formation, a flying geometric block. Each bomber would no longer fly in a flat line, but interlocked in layers, weaving a lattice of crossfire. He called it the combat box. Each box was made up of 3 squadrons, arranged like a pyramid. The lead squadron in the center at standard altitude. The high squadron offset to the right, 150 feet above. The low squadron offset to the left, 150 feet below. From afar, it looked like a 3-dimensional fortress, compact, balanced, and deadly. When one aircraft was attacked, at least 4 other guns from surrounding planes could instantly retaliate. Inside a drafty wooden operations hut at Chelveston, LeMay gathered his squadron commanders. He pointed to the chart and spoke in his deep, rasping tone. We can't depend on luck. We depend on structure. Each airplane is a brick. The formation is the fortress. The men present: Elatin Columbia William Hatcher, Major Jack Lyle. Captain Morgan listened in silence. They knew he was right, but also that it bordered on impossible. Maintaining tight formation at 25,000 feet, in thin air, through flak bursts and propeller turbulence from dozens of bombers, was like trying to steer a storm. One slip of the hand, and wings could collide. But LeMay refused to hear impossible. We'll retrain every crew, every squadron. They'll fly close enough to read the tail numbers of the plane beside them. Training began at once. Over the gray English skies, dozens of B-17s circled for hours. LeMay flew in the lead ship, adjusting spacing himself. He signaled with gloved hands. Closer. Up 50 feet. Hold that speed. On the ground officers charted every flight path. Errors were punished. Altitude drift corrected immediately. The young pilots grumbled that LeMay was too harsh, but soon they understood. Between life and death, 10 meters could make all the difference. When the formation finally locked together, 18 B-17s flew so close that sunlight flashed from one wing to the next in a seamless glint across the sky. From the ground, they looked like one giant slab of moving steel. Slow, steady, invulnerable. Then, on a foggy December morning, the combat box flew into combat for the first time. Target, Liel, Northern France. 48 B-17s from the 305th and 306th bomb groups climbed into the air in the new formation, crossing the channel. On the other side, the Luftwaffe was ready squadrons of FW-190A-4S and B, F-109G2S, taking off from Cambrai and Weavy, LG Hem. As they approached, the German pilots were stunned. Gone were the scattered fortresses of before. Now there was a single block of steel, bristling with guns, every angle-covered dot. When the cry came, bandits, 9 o'clock. High, 200 Browning M2 machine guns erupted at once. The sky blazed with fire. The German fighters dove in, but met a wall of lead. Later, a Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his diary, "They looked like a swarm of giant porcupines. No matter which way we came, dozens of guns turned toward us." From that day, the B-17 earned a new nickname, the Flying Porcupine. The Lille raid ended with astonishing results. Most B-17s returned, only a few badly damaged. Losses were nearly cut in half. When the crews landed, LeMay was waiting. He didn't smile. He simply nodded and said in his gravelly voice, "You've just proved we can survive if we fly together." From that day, one rule was painted on every operations wall: stay in formation or you die. But the combat box was more than a formation. It was a symbol of a new mindset. Collective warfare in the age of machines. Inside each box, every gun, every crewman, every B-17 became part of a single living organism. If one link broke, the whole structure failed. LeMay pushed further. He expanded formations to 21 bombers, then 254 per wing. The skies became layered with boxers. Lead box, high box, low box, stacked 4 miles across the heavens, a moving wall of iron. American airmen learned to trust one another. They knew the plane on their right guarded their flank, and the tail gun of another might save their lives. Those who once feared the sky now felt safer within the formation. Te, kadit, eat, iron, confidence. Yet every innovation came with a price. Staying in formation meant no evasive maneuvers. When flak filled the air, they had to hold course, flying straight through the storm to keep the box intact. Pilots felt every shudder of the wind, every metallic thud of shrapnel striking the fuselage like hail. But no one broke rank. One gunner later recalled. It was crazy. The sky was exploding, black smoke all around, holes ripping through the wings. But if you looked left and saw your buddy still there, you just kept flying. From Kilveston, LeMay's idea spread across the entire 8th Air Force. Every group was trained to fly by the same rule. By early 1943, the phrase, combat box, had become the standard for every daylight raid over Europe. As the sun set over the English countryside, returning B-17s appeared in the dim light, flying in tight, steady formation, engines droning in perfect unison. On the ground, LeMay stood with arms folded, watching them land. He said, nothing. To him, the combat box was more than a tactic. It was proof that amid the chaos of war, order and discipline could save lives. And high above, through the clouds streaked with smoke, the Germans began to realize something. The age of the lonely missions was over. From now on, they would face not individual bombers, but vast, moving walls of fire, the flying porcupines crawling inexorably across the European sky. The wind howled around the cockpit as the B-17 Mary Ruth shuddered violently through the thick cloud layers. At over 25,000 feet, the air was so thin that each breath froze on the oxygen mask. Up front, Lieutenant Jack Dawson gripped the control column tight, eyes fixed on another B-17 flying just a few meters off his wing. Behind him, 10 men were fighting too. Not only against the Germans, but against the merciless sky itself. It was December 1942, the first time the 8th Air Force tested the combat box formation in a real mission, striking the power plant at Lille, northern France. Colonel Curtis LeMay's idea had come to life. Instead of long, fragile lines, easily broken apart, B-17 groups now flew in tight 3-tier formations. High, middle, and low, forming a 3-dimensional box of fire, where every gun could cover the others. But holding that formation came at a brutal cost. The prop wash from the bomber ahead slammed into the wings, shaking the entire airframe. Pilots had to fly with surgical precision. A deviation of just a few degrees could mean collision. You had to fly as if your wing was bolted to his, one pilot said. One mistake, and the whole squadron pays. Below, German radar screens lit up. 88mm flak guns rose from the French fields, exploding in black bursts that smeared across the blue sky. In the cockpit, Jack heard the clatter of shrapnel hitting the fuselage, tearing through the thin aluminum skin. But the formation held. No one broke away. Tinte. Came Messerschmitt. Bf-109s, diving out of the sun, using the same tactic they had for months. But these time things were different. As the German fighters dove in, they met a wall of lead, dozens of Browning M2.50 caliber guns spitting fire in perfect crosspath. The overlapping arcs of the combat box turned the air ahead into a furnace. One Bf-109 caught fire and spiraled down, a glowing ember falling from the sky. In that instant, the American crews realized LeMay was right. They could survive if they held formation. When the mission ended, only a few B-17s were lost, far fewer than before. On the way home, the squadron radio crackled with LeMay's voice. Good work, boys. We've found the way. From that day on, stay in formation or you die became the unwritten law of daylight bombing. Every morning, as the sun rose over the misty runways of East Anglia, hundreds of airmen climbed into their flying fortresses, knowing that the only thing that could save them wasn't luck, it was discipline. One bomber breaking formation could collapse the entire defensive system and become easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Some young pilots, trembling from fear or exhaustion, still kept their position when engines overheated, when prop wash battered their wings, when the bomber beside them went down in flames. They knew that breaking away to dodge flak meant dying faster. Amid the smoke and chaos, voices screamed over the radio. "Hold formation! Don't break!" Statistics soon proved it true. More than half of all B-17s shot down were those that broke formation, but the squadrons that stayed tight, even with damaged engines, riddled wings, or wounded crews, had twice the chance of making it home. From then on, the combat box wasn't just a tac ticket. Was a creed. It bound every crew together into a single organism. One man guarded another's tail. One gun shielded another's wing. In the thunder of engines and flak, they learned that true strength didn't lie in a single flying fortress, but in the sky, moving as one. That night, when the squadron returned to Chelveston, the sun had already sunk behind the gray rooftops. Oil and gunpowder still clung to their uniforms, but in their eyes burned a new belief. The combat box had proven that even in a sky full of death, there was order, one rule above all: stay in formation or die. On the cold, misty morning of October 14th, 1943, the skies over England were heavy and gray. On the runways of the 8th Air Force, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses lined up, their Pratt & Whitney engines roaring like thunder. The target, Schweinfurt, the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry, the mechanical lifeblood of the Third Reich. If they could destroy it, they could cripple Hitler's entire war machine. But everyone knew the truth. This was a suicide mission. Schweinfurt lay deep within Germany, far beyond the range of P-47 Thunderbolt escorts. Once they crossed the Rhine, they would be alone. At 6:30 a.m., 291 B-17s lifted off from their East Anglia bases. The rising sun glinted off their aluminum skins, turning the bomber stream into a silver river across the clouds. Lieutenant Robert Taylor of the 100th Bomb Group took a deep breath before pulling back on the yoke. "We'll get there," he muttered. "And, if we're lucky, we'll get back." As the flying fortresses crossed into Germany, the Luftwaffe was waiting. Hundreds of FW-190s and Bf-109s rose from the low clouds, attacking in waves, using the deadly Stern-Angriff. The Star attack, they didn't strike individual planes but converged on the center of the combat box, knowing that one precise hit could shatter the entire formation. From afar, the American crews saw dark specks growing larger. Then the radio burst to life. "Bandits, 12 o'clock. Hi? Moments later, the sky exploded. German 20mm cannon shells and WGR-21 rockets tore through the bomber stream like flaming arrows. A B-17 nicknamed 909 took a direct hit to the cockpit. Fire erupted, and the plane spiraled into the clouds, gone in seconds. Still, the formation held. Tail gunners fired belt after belt of ammunition, hands shaking from cold and fear. The .50 caliber Brownings rattled furiously, mixing with the shriek of shrapnel tearing through thin aluminum. Some pilots, flying on two or even one engine, refused to break formation, knowing that to drift away meant certain death within a minute. At 25,000 feet, the sky had become hell itself. Smoke, flame, and burning wreckage filled the clouds. German fighters dove head-on, some willing to die just to break the steel box, advancing toward the factories. Each explosion marked another flying fortress falling, 10 men at a time. On Teground, German villagers looked up to see long trails of smoke like blood streaks across the heavens. By the time the bombers reached Schweiner, less than 2/3 of the force remained. But they pressed on. The bomb bay doors opened, and thousands of 500-pound bombs dropped onto the industrial city below. The earth shook. The factories burned, black smoke rising like towers into the sky. The mission was accomplished, but at a terrible cost. On the way home, the massacre continued. With no escorts left, scattered B-17s were hunted down all the way to the Dutch border. Little Miss Mischief caught fire. Her pilot ordered the crew to bail out. As he floated down, he saw the ground below blazing white parachutes falling through pillars of black smoke. That evening, when the surviving bombers landed in England, silence swept across the airfields. 60 aircraft were lost. Over 650 men were missing or dead. Some of the returning planes were barely airworthy, wings torn, engines dead, fuselages riddled like beehives. Yet they made it home, one surviving pilot recalled. I looked around, and half the group was gone. We'd flown through hell. The 8th Air Force would name that day Black Thursday. It became a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, and of the deadly price of daylight bombing. Despite the devastation, the Schweinfurt raid proved one thing. The combat box could hold the line, but it could not fight alone forever. The airmen now understood that, to win back the skies over Europe, they needed something more. A protector fast, long-ranged, and powerful enough to stay with them all the way to Germany and back. And in those dark days, amid smoke and twisted metal, the U.S. Army Air Forces began searching for that answer, a machine that would change the course of the air war. Its name was about to enter history. The P-51 Mustang. In early 1944, the surviving pilots of Black Thursday returned to the foggy runways of East Anglia, their eyes heavy with both grief and resolve. The 8th Air Force had lost thousands of men, hundreds of B-17s torn apart over Germany. Eve Dine Canayo, without long-range fighter escorts. Deep penetration bombing missions were nothing short of suicide. Then one day, amid the mud and melting snow of the airfields, they saw something new. A sleek silhouette, long fuselage, graceful wings, and a cockpit glinting under the pale sunlight. When its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared to life, it didn't growl like the old Thunderbolt. It sang with a smooth, powerful note, like a predator awakening. It was the P-51 Mustang, the Warhorse no one expected to change the entire air war. Originally commissioned by the British as a reconnaissance aircraft, the Mustang became a legend when the Americans replaced its Allison engine with the Merlin 61. The transformation was astonishing. Speeds over 700 kilometers per hour, a range of 2,000 kilometers, and the ability to climb fast and keep power at high altitude, right where the flying fortresses operated. With the Mustang, the dream of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin was no longer fantasy. In February 1944, the U.S. Air Force launched Big Week, a massive campaign to crush Germany's aircraft industry. And for the first time, as the B-17s roared deep into enemy skies, they were not alone. Mustangs marked with the USAAF insignia soared alongside the bomber formations, steel guardians cutting through the blue. When German radar screens lit up, Luftwaffe pilots immediately recognized their new adversary, faster, more agile, and utterly fearless. Over Hanover and Leipzig, fierce dogfights erupted. The FW-190s and Bf-109s attacked like wolves. But this time, the flock of B-17s wasn't defenseless anymore. The Mustangs struck first, diving like silver arrows. German ace Franz, Stigler later recalled. It felt like we were fighting death itself. The Mustang could climb, turn, and dive faster than any Bf-109 could follow. Over the radio, American bomber crews shouted with joy. Little friends are here. Let's go home, boys. Those little friends, the affectionate nickname bomber crews gave to the Mustangs, became their living shields. They escorted the bombers across the Rhine, all the way to Berlin, and back again. Along the way, they didn't just defend, they hunted. Mustangs chased Luftwaffe fighters back to their bases, strafing runways and burning aircraft before they could even take off. On every mission, Mustang pilots would take off minutes ahead, climbing higher than the bomber stream. When enemy fighters appeared, they dived from above, turning Luftwaffe ambushes into massacres. Wittenmann's German air power was bleeding out. Hundreds of fighters were destroyed. Many of their veteran aces never came home. By March 1944, the P-51 Mustang was over Berlin. What had once seemed impossible was now real. B-17s, shielded by Mustangs, were dropping bombs on Hitler's capital, the beating heart of the Third Reich. No one called them suicide missions anymore. From then on, they were missions of victory steps toward ending the war. As the conflict drew to a close, the Mustang conquered every sky, from burning German cities to the mountains of Italy and the wide Pacific over Japan. American pilots believed that without the Mustang, thousands more would never have come home. At Debden Airfield, Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier, once said, "If you're flying a Mustang, you've always got a chance to come back." And among the 17 crews, there was a saying everyone understood: "If I see a Mustang off my wing, I know I'll live one more day." Thus, from the ashes of the darkest days, the P-51 Mustang rose, not just as an airplane, but as a symbol of hope and American ingenuity. It didn't just save lives, it changed the fate of the air war itself. When the war finally ended, the sight of B-17 flying fortresses and P-51 Mustangs flying side by side over the European sunset became eternal, a symbol of discipline, courage, and unbreakable faith in those who had flown through hell and made it home.